In the breathless heat of a Natchez August, when the river crawled like a dark animal and cicadas drilled the hours into your skull, 30 plates clinked beneath a chandelier made of Carolina glass. It was Sunday supper at Enslaved Plantation, roast pork shining with glaze, rice fluffed high as clouds, sweet custards trembling in their cups. At the head of the table sat Judge Asa Pritchard, a man who signed his name like a blade. By night's end, every white throat in that dining room would be clawing for air. What the sheriff found 2 days later would refuse explanation. Half-emptied goblets slick with a strange, almond bitter tang, toppled chairs frozen mid-panic, dogs collapsed on the porch steps, tongues blue as cornflowers. And in the kitchen, where the hearth was still warm, a woman in a smoke-stained apron sat at the table, turning a wooden spoon in her hand like a rosary. Her name was Ruth. When they asked her what happened, she met the lawman's eyes, calm as the river before a storm, and said 5 words in a voice that never shook: "Bitter feeds what bitter sowed." The coroner wrote fever. The judge's friends wrote letters that vanished into drawers. The county clerk stamped a stack of papers closed and slid them into a vault under the Natchez bluffs. But paper can't muffle a kitchen's memory, and kitchens talk. Tonight, we are opening the door you were told was nail shut. Before we go any further into the meal that unseated a dynasty, do me one favor: hit subscribe and ring the bell, because stories like this get buried on purpose. And drop a comment with where you're listening from. Is there a road in your town you won't drive at night? A house that never sells because the dining room stays cold? Tell me. Now, back to the stove. 15 years before the supper that turned to ash, Ruth stepped off a flatboat in the rain with a sack and a recipe in her head for surviving men like Asa Pritchard. She didn't learn it from books. She learned it from watching the river, which takes and still looks patient. In the kitchens of New Orleans, she'd been a shadow with a knife, chopping, stirring, learning what makes a man unguarded. On paper, she was property. In practice, she became something else, the heartbeat of Rosebend. By the time the judge's first wife coughed herself thin, Ruth could calm a fever with broth, feed 50 with scraps, and time a stew to the minute between outbursts in the parlor. The big house trusted her because trust is lazy when it's comfortable. She learned who watered their bourbon, who salted heavy, who pushed fat to the rim of the plate, and who licked it clean. She listened when the overseers laughed too hard at nothing. She watched which ledger drawer stuck and which keys sat under which saucers. And every Sunday, before the family said a grace that never reached the cabins beyond the magnolias, Ruth stood at the hearth and counted breaths, hers last. There are things we won't say plainly here. Not because we are afraid, because we don't hand out the tools men use to make rooms go quiet. You should know only this: in the cane-choked windbreak behind the kitchen, certain bitter leaves learned to grow where other things died. In the pantry, blue glass jars caught light like secrets, and Ruth understood what every river cook understands: heat hides flavors, and time changes everything. By the summer of 1819, some say 1821, Natchez keeps 2 calendars, one for business, one for ghosts. Judge Pritchard had enemies he prayed about and enemies he didn't know existed. He had a new wife who wore pearls to breakfast and touched Ruth's wrist when she wanted the room warmer. He had a son who carried a whip like a habit. And he had plans to stretch Rosebend another mile along the river, to import more bodies, to break his fields into squares as neat as a ledger. Expansion, he called it. Ruth heard another word: hunger. 3 nights before the supper, the judge brought home guests, men with court rings and bank laughter, men who didn't look directly at the quarters as their carriages rolled past. The kitchen flared like a forge. Ruth ran it like a quiet war. Chickens hissed in fat. Okra went silk in the pot. The oven door sighed and sighed again. Hannah, the scullery girl, watched Ruth's hands the way a sailor watches sky, for warnings. "Miss Ruth." Hannah whispered, low enough to keep her life. "You hear them say the names." "I heard," Ruth said, smoothing an apron that had been white once. Then she did something she almost never did. She pressed a coin into Hannah's palm and nodded at the back steps. "Go sit with your aunt tonight." Take the long path. Don't cut by the porch. That was the first door. The second door was a key that had lived under the sugar caddy for a decade. That night, it lived in Ruth's pocket. The third door was a sound, the piano in the parlor. The new wife liked a hymn called Rock of Ages, only she played it too fast, like she was afraid the stone would roll away. Ruth listened to the chords spill down the hallway and counted between them. Not measures. Chances. Sunday came like a bruise. The table glittered. The men joked about cotton that hadn't rained yet and laws that would never pass. Ruth ladled gravy, wiped drips that weren't there, and watched the judge's son cut his meat as if he were disciplining it. She kept the kitchen running with eye flicks and breath. She hummed, just under the noise, a tune her mother had used to time a gumbo when the roof leaked. Here is the only recipe you get tonight: a steady hand, a hotter fire, and patience big enough to swallow a river. When the bell rang for the final course, Ruth lifted the tray that held 3 dozen custards, silk set in porcelain. She didn't tremble. She didn't blink. She stepped through the doorway with the same measured grace that had kept her alive for 15 years. And every man at that table smiled like a clock striking the hour. The dining room door's side shut like a stage curtain. In the kitchen, heat breathed from the brick oven, washing the walls with a low, steady pulse. Ruth set the tray down, counted to 4, and touched each porcelain cup as if blessing it. She glanced to the scullery doorway where Hannah's apron string still swung, the ghost of a girl who had taken the long path. Good. The house had its own weather. Chandeliers tinkled when the river wind changed. Floorboards by the study held their breath when ledgers came out. Tonight, a pressure built that only cooks know, the hush before the first spoon breaks cream, the tilt of conversations just starting to lean. Ruth wiped her hands on muslin that had seen every season of this plantation and listened. In the parlor, a man laughed too loud. In the hall, the judge's son sharpened a joke to a point. Ruth heard the click of his ring against glass and knew it by sound alone. She checked the hearth. Fire steady. She checked the doors. The nonsensical brass hook on the back porch was flipped the wrong way. A sign from the yard boy. One patrolman gone to cards, one to sleep. And the milk pan on the windowsill wore a ring of condensation the size of a silver dollar, just big enough for a message only the kitchen understood. A road clear to the cabins, if anyone had reason to run. Miss Ruth, came a whisper-like paper. It was Thomas, barely 12, hair sticking in the heat. The judge say the tart's waiting. Then let the tarts wait, she said, and the boy startled at her softness. Ruth's voice usually had edges that kept people alive. She wrapped his wrist in her palm for a heartbeat. You didn't eat from the table scrap today. He shook his head, eyes wide. Good, she said. When you wash, use the pump in the yard. Not the cistern. Understand? He didn't. He nodded anyway and vanished, a moth into shadow. The tray felt like a promise when she lifted it again, heavier with every step toward the double doors. She moved through the kitchen like she was still a cipher, the person everyone looked through to see the plates behind her. Every Sunday had taught them not to see her. Tonight, she held them to that training. The doors opened. Oil lamps picked out the shine on the custards. Conversation thinned as sugar and cinnamon announced themselves like polite royalty. Ruth placed each cup with practiced care, the clink of porcelain a metronome. She started with the judge, because ceremony keeps fools calm. She ended at the new wife, whose pearl necklace trembled on a throat that had never missed a meal. When the last cup left the tray, Ruth exhaled. A small thing. A river pebble falling. She took 2 steps back and let the room take itself. Beyond the windows, the Natchez trace kept its old secrets. In the quarters, Hannah counted her aunt's beads twice, then twice again, and refused to name the fear that crossed the yard on quiet feet. In the trees, something hooted once and then thought better of it. In the dining room, men lifted porcelain, breathed sugar, and tipped their heads to the same fate as if obeying a single, invisible hand. It begins, always, with a silence that doesn't fit the hour. The judges just land short. The banker's fork stops mid-air, a silver tremor. Someone's smile takes too long to close. Then the heat of the room moves under the skin of men who haven't sweated since they could afford not to. Ruth watched without staring. She moved to the sideboard, adjusted a napkin that did not need adjusting, and gave the house what it wanted: normalcy. "More coffee, sir?" she asked the corner where conversations die. No one answered, which was the answer. She poured anyway, a thin black stream, the sound of routine. At the top of the table, Judge Pritchard blinked, once, twice, like a man staring down a long hallway and not liking what he saw at the end. The new wife's hand went to her collarbone. The judge's son laughed again, too sharp, then coughed, then didn't stop. Spoons chimed against porcelain. A gasp slid under the table like a dropped knife. The steward took one step forward and then another back, as if learning to walk in a strange dream. The chandelier made a tiny sound like frost cracking. Someone whispered, "Is it the heat?" And another voice, cool, educated, said, "Open a window," which is what people say when they have never needed air. Ruth folded a napkin and placed it in a perfect square. She looked quickly to the far door. The seamstress who mended table linens had left a thread on the latch, her warning. The veranda door had stuck the afternoon before. It would stick again. Good to know. She measured the distance to the pantry, the path past the dumbwaiter. A lifetime of moving soundlessly in rooms like this had taught her the map of escape, the architecture of survival. The bitter climbed slow and then all at once. A red-faced planter pressed fingers to his lips as if holding a secret, then swallowed it wrong. The banker's wife reached for her husband's sleeve and found sweat slicker than wax. The judge rose, chair legs rasping, and the room tilted on that sound, as if the house itself had shifted its weight. "Ruth," he said, and his voice wasn't a command this time. It was a question he didn't know how to phrase. She stepped forward with a carafe. "Yes, sir." His eyes, pale as gristle, tried to pin her to something that would make sense. But sense had left by the side door 5 minutes ago. None of them noticed open. He reached for his glass and missed it. The new wife stood up too fast and sat right back down like a marionette whose strings had snarled. "My chest," she whispered, and it wasn't to anyone in particular. The judge's son's laugh turned inside out, became a sound with nothing human in it, and then cut off. At the threshold, a footman froze. Ruth caught his gaze and gave him a look he recognized from 100 quiet emergencies. "Do as you are not told." He vanished like smoke. A chair fell. Silver clattered. A plate spun in place and shivered itself to stillness. Out on the porch, one of the hounds hiccuped, whined, and sagged against the rail. The river kept moving. Ruth touched the back of her own neck, where heat pulled. She breathed and counted. She stepped toward the nearest window and unlatched it. Air rolled in, the small mercy of a moving world. The judge said, "Call," and then his tongue felt too large to shape the word. "Doctor," someone croaked. But the doctor was at this table. After the first crack in the veneer comes the slide. Gentlemen make shapes in the air with their hands, failing to catch breath as if it were a moth. The new wife's pearls click softly as her pulse turns into a bell and rings inside her throat. The doctor, who has never bled except under supervision, fumbles for a bag that isn't there and then tries to remember what he has ever done for himself. Ruth keeps moving. She gathers a plate, a knife, 2 napkins, props, and crosses the room like a tide. She tilts a chair upright to clear a path that will matter when panic grows legs. She lays a hand on the judge's shoulder, only for an instant, as if to steady him. He looks at her hand as though he has never seen it before, which is true in all the ways that count. "Water," someone gasps. "For God's sake." "In the kitchen," Ruth says, and the steward startles as if woken. He takes 2 steps and staggers, catching himself on the edge of the sideboard so hard a decanter rings. In the kitchen, Ruth already knows which pitcher is safe and which to drop in the yard. She knows which drawer sticks unless you tug with your left hand. She knows how to keep hands from touching what hands mustn't touch. She is a dam holding back a river with nothing but bone and will. She pauses in the pantry and closes her eyes. A face rises behind them. Her brother's, rimmed in fever light from a winter they keep out of the official family Bible. She hears again the judge's voice as he weighed the price of lives in pounds and shillings, and the time it takes to break a man's back properly. The memory passes like lightning, too fast, bright enough to leave the world obvious behind it. She re-enters the dining room with a pitcher of well water and a stack of clean cloths. She sets the pitcher down untouched, sets the cloths near enough to be seen, and takes the new wife's wrist in a grasp that looks like care and is. The pulse rattles there like a trapped bird. Ruth hears it, memorizes it, lets it go. The woman's eyes find Ruth's. They are not enemies in this blink. They are two women in a house that eats women on the hour. Ruth adjusts the pearls away from the throat, a mercy, then steps back to keep the room in her sight. The judge's son lurches to his feet, bangs into a chair, snaps at Ruth as if words were a whip that could return the world to order. "What is this?" he gasps. "A supper," Ruth says. He swears, then folds at the waist in a clumsy prayer and grips the table until his knuckles pale. The first man goes to the floor. The sound is a terrible punctuation, full stop. After that, the room loses grammar altogether. Ruth looks toward the hall. Shapes crowd it, overseers unsure if they've been summoned, housemaids who came on reflex and are now rooted. She tilts her head, 1 degree, and most of them hear it the way you feel a storm before it speaks. They retreat, the luckiest decision they'll make this year. The judge tries to stand again and fails. He is struggling with a lifetime of not being told no. He finally looks where he has never looked, at Ruth, not around her. "Help," he says, and it is both command and the first prayer he's ever uttered without a witness to write it down. Ruth nods, because kindness is still hers to give or deny, and crosses the room to unbolt the veranda door herself. The night enters, smelling of water and cut grass and distance. It touches the men at the table and finds them wanting. By dawn, the big house trembles as if a great hand had picked it up and set it down crooked. The hounds lie in a row like a tragic trick. Servants whisper from thresholds, their voices stripped to a wire. Someone pries a window stuck since spring. Someone else decides not to ring the bell that would have carried a lie across the yard. The men who can move badly. The ones who can speak, choose numbers, heartbeats, minutes, names. None of the numbers matter. When the sheriff finally arrives, boots muddy with other people's mornings, he meets a silence he doesn't trust. 2 deputies fan out, peering into corners as if the corners might confess. The sheriff finds Ruth at the kitchen table, where the fire has settled into its oldest shape. She isn't stirring a pot or scrubbing a pan. She is sitting, the spoon turned end over end in her fingers like a rosary someone has forgotten how to pray. Her eyes hold the flat surface of a river when it's deepest and most dangerous. "You were in this room?" the sheriff asks. "I am always in this room," she says. He glances at a ledger the steward left open. The numbers look like a foreign alphabet. He closes it as if that fixes anything and attends to the living. "We'll fetch a doctor." "You passed one on the way in," Ruth says, and it takes them a moment to understand. The sheriff is not a cruel man, not the worst this parish has seen. He is, however, very tired. What happened here? Ruth looks down at her hands, at the spoon that turns and never changes. "Bitter feeds," she says softly. "What bitter sowed?" He waits for the rest and, when it doesn't come, tries to bait it. "Give me names." "You know all their names," Ruth answers. "You used to sit in the same pew with them." He stares at her, calls for a deputy to comb the grounds, which is a thing men say when they need distance. He asks the steward 3 questions, gets a verse of stammers. He asks the new wife, who looks through him as if sight were a luxury. He writes the word fever where a truth might have gone. A boy in the yard runs to the cabins with a pail and a story. It changes 5 times as it crosses the grass. By the time it reaches Hannah's aunt, it is a tale about a table that bit back. That version will outlive everyone who's standing here. At noon, a coroner from town arrives with his traveling chest of answers. He lifts chins, examines tongues, checks eyes for a moonlit silver he doesn't find. He smells a casserole dish and decides against it. He takes down statements and arranges them into a monument that won't stay standing. Spoiled goods, he proposes, and the banker's widow flinches at the word spoiled without knowing why. The coroner repeats it until it feels like a fact. When he asks Ruth, she gives him nothing he can bottle and sell. You fed them, he says, and it isn't a question. I fed this house, Ruth says, for 15 years. Through storms you complain about and storms we patched the roof during so you wouldn't have to. He nods like a man who has heard an opinion. He writes, house slave, female, cook. He underlines nothing. He closes his book with a snap that implies closure. If paper could keep a secret, the South would be empty. 15 years is a long time to gather an education in how men do harm. Ruth earned hers with burns up both forearms from ovens that never rested, with feet that learned to step around tantrums that shatter glass, with eyes that learn to learn. She learned from the judge how a pen makes violence ordinary. From his first wife she learned the sound of a kindness that arrives 1 second too late. From the son she learned that boys rehearse cruelty like they rehearse spelling, with the same grim emphasis on getting it right. There was a winter when cattle died at the far end of the north field and the men blamed a wind. Ruth saw the tracks and knew what really took them, hunger sharpened by miscount. That same winter, a girl named Lizette with hands like willow twigs tried to run and didn't make the tree line. Ruth didn't attend the punishment. The kitchen had a pie crust that wouldn't hold and a stove that needed tending. But she heard the hours. She measured them with biscuits and coffee and the way the air thinned when somebody prayed for luck instead of change. There was a spring when the judge decided sugarcane could do what cotton couldn't, and men who already owed him spent 2 months in mud that remembered their names when they came back. He sent for more bodies and got them and wrote in his ledger, neat as pews, how they fit into his plans. Ruth saw the man who delivered them count his money. Ruth watched him leave. There was a summer when fever came to the quarters like a song you can't stop humming. People went off like matches for a month, and the judge held services on the porch to prove his heart was tender. He spoke of providence and soil and God's inscrutable arithmetic. Ruth stirred broth for 6 days in a row and slept sitting up, head on forearm, because the kitchen never closed. On the 7th day she woke to a silence louder than thunder. She counted the bowls on the shelf without looking. The number was less by 4. She didn't cry because the kitchen wouldn't be mopped if she did. No one can tell you exactly when a plan begins, because plans don't begin. They sediment. They become the floor you stand on without noticing. The first layer, a borrowed book left on a chair in the parlor, a pharmacopoeia too fine for these parts, written for men who fancied themselves doctors. Ruth didn't read the words. She watched the pictures and learned the shapes of leaves rich men thought were exotic and poor women used because the body is a country where knowledge is inherited, not owned. The second layer, a lesson from an old woman in the quarters who knew how to take the sting out of a bee, the severity out of a cough, the edge off a man. People called her conjure because a word like nurse implies respect. Ruth watched the way the old woman pinched a leaf between forefinger and thumb, watching the color it left. She watched which jars the old woman kept in the sun and which in the dark. She kept her questions behind her teeth like pearls. The third layer, time. Time enough to know which cupboards never closed right and which men grew greedy when the room approved. Time enough to learn a house breathes and sweats and snores and sometimes smiles behind your back. Time enough to wait. The men who lived needed a story they could live with. Spoiled custard made them look foolish but not culpable. A bad barrel of eggs they'd bought from an untrustworthy vendor threatened only their pride and a lawsuit. A plot conjured by the people they owned would not fit in any ledger they could bear to open. So the coroner wrote fever, and the sheriff wrote investigated, and the newspaper did not write anything at all. Judge Pritchard's burial was as proper as a lie can be. Black crepe drifted in the hall like fog. The new wife moved her mouth through hymns as if translating them from a language she didn't speak. The judge's son appeared in a jacket he couldn't fill, like a boy playing his father on a poor stage. Men with ropes in their voices said words over the box and winked at each other when they ran out of scripture. 50 yards away, the cabins measured grief on a separate scale. After the funeral, the bankman pulled the new wife aside and said numbers that were a threat waiting for a signature. The overseer stood behind them, eyes on the yard, and waited for orders that would feel like a plan and be one in the mouth only. The judge's son pointed at the kitchen and said something that sounded like a sentence. It was easier to blame the room than the system. That night, a meeting, the kind the law pretends it doesn't know about, gathered in the courthouse. Men slapped hats against their thighs and took a vote on what to do with the woman whose hands fed them. One of them said the word hang and found it did not make the others into a chorus. Another said sell, and they nodded because that felt civil and because cruelty on paper is their favorite kind. The sheriff looked at Ruth's face in his mind and made his jaw do something that passed for swallowing. They sent word south. A buyer would come on Tuesday, specializing in places where the work unmade you. They didn't say that they were afraid to kill her here because some deaths break houses. They said transport. They said unfortunate. They said she will be out of your hair. Ruth swept the kitchen. She folded aprons the way you fold a flag when you don't want it to touch the floor. She burned a stack of recipe scraps by the hearth, lists of amounts and timings learned from women long dead. She did not burn one thing, a tiny cloth book with names, not of dishes, but of people who had eaten them. She pressed it under a loose board that knew her footsteps like children know mercy. Hannah came to the doorway and stood without stepping over the threshold. Miss Ruth. They taking you? Ruth did not answer a question that had already become memory. Can you make biscuits without looking at your hands? Hannah nodded and lied. Yes. Then you'll do it. Ruth paused. Tell Thomas never to drink first. Hannah nodded again, not understanding the shape of that warning but feeling its weight. Where you goin'? Where they send me, Ruth said. And then where I mean to. When the buyer arrived, the river pretended to be a mirror and was not. The paperwork was efficient. Men signed their names and relieved themselves of the burden of thinking. Ruth was loaded into a wagon with a dignity that made onlookers uncomfortable. She did not cry. She did not curse. She sat like a ledger that balanced itself. Half a mile down the trace, a fog rolled in from nowhere with the swagger of a man who knows a secret. The driver reined up, cursed the curtain the river had thrown across his road, and gave the horses a rest. He took a swallow from a flask to keep from naming fear. He did not see the boy in the trees, the one who had spent the last 3 nights sleeping in pine needles to learn fog's habits. He did not see the 2 shapes that stepped from the ditch where weeds wear shoes. He felt the shift in the wagon only after it had happened, after the rope on the back gate hung slack as breath. He turned, but fog is very good at being an accomplice. The shapes he thought he saw were already become shadows. He took another swallow and told his heart to be quiet. Must have been a branch, he said to the fog, who did not answer. By the time the fog lifted and the driver's stomach remembered hunger, the road was empty in exactly the way that means it isn't. Back at Rosebent, the overseer cursed men with flasks and fogs with timing. The sheriff counted days until someone wrote him a letter that excused him from caring. The new wife stared at the kitchen doorway at night and listened for a spoon. A story travels faster than a wagon if it wants to. Before the buyer sobered, the quarters at Rosebent knew a version of events that was better than prayer. By week's end, 3 other plantations had heard a rumor. A woman in Natchez sat in a kitchen like a general and the house never ate the same way again. The rumor was not precise because rumors are not recipes. It was precise enough to do work. At Macabre Plantation, A cook laid out spoons in a pattern no one noticed and told the scullery boy to wash in the creek for no reason at all. At Dogwood Bend, a housemaid forgot the punch bowl and brought cider instead. At a plantation whose name isn't worth your breath, 3 men found their glasses moved an inch to the left and didn't ask why. None of those things make a story for a newspaper, which is why some of them matter. Planters began to travel with soldiers disguised as friends. They paid extra for ice. They told their cooks to taste every dish first, then pretended suspicion was just a new form of management. In kitchens, women learned to swallow and smile without letting anybody own their eyes. Some cooks said no to working in the big house, preferring smoke and ash in the yard to polished death. Some cooks said yes and watched with a patience that looks like surrender to men who don't understand time. The preachers preached. God sees, they said, and the congregations nodded and looked over their shoulders toward kitchens. The judge in the next county assembled a committee to examine safety standards. They wrote a list that began with locks and ended with prayer. A banker proposed household tasters, people whose hunger could buy their owners an extra 10 minutes of confidence. A yellow dog bit him on the ankle the next day, and he learned something he could not put in a ledger. In the pine light between cabins at Rosebend, Hannah practiced biscuits until flour dusted her hair like winter. Thomas learned to wash in the creek so well the water loved him and lifted his face like a mother. Old women sat outside evenings and named people under their breath, a head count of the living disguised as gossip. The kitchen acquired a sound like a hum you can only hear when you close your eyes. A song started. No one wrote it. No one claims to have heard it first. Don't drink first, don't drink last, keep your eyes on the one who pours. It went, with a rhythm you can stir to. Children sang it bouncing a ball made of rags. Men sang it to themselves when they had to go into houses that never learned to see them. The tune traveled faster than fog. The river keeps its own counsel. A flatboat drifted down out of Kentucky full of corn whiskey and broken hearts. It tied up under the bluffs and sold one and kept the other. A woman came off the boat carrying a folded bundle no one inspected. She walked like a person who knew the geometry of private doors. She did not look up at the houses. She looked at their shadows. She walked past the courthouse and did not spit. She bought a bundle of grains in the market with a coin whose origin no one could trace. A boy named Thomas, out on an errand he'd made up, followed her for 3 turns and then lost her on a street that doesn't exist when the sun is wrong. 2 nights later, a candle burned in the kitchen of a boarding house that was supposed to be asleep. A woman with a scar on her wrist like the liner rope leaves took a seat at the table. 2 men sat across from her and did not meet her eyes because they were not free to. One of them wore a jacket too fine for his hands. He had a preacher's mouth and a gambler's shoes. The other smelled like gun oil and mint leaves. They put nothing on the table. The woman put a wooden spoon down as if it were a document. The men flinched as if it were a gun. "You know the roads," she said. Her voice was not a question, nor an invitation. It was a fact asking to be true. "We know some," the mint-smelling man allowed. "You know kitchens," she said, finally looking at the preacher's mouth. He swallowed. "We kiss the hands that feed us, "I don't need those hands kissed," she said. "I need them listened to." They talked for an hour in a grammar without proper nouns. When they left separately. The woman washed the spoon and set it to dry on a towel that had seen too much and said nothing. Word went up the trace that some houses had begun to hire new cooks, white ones, with references and certificates printed by men who sold fear in folios. Those cooks lasted 2 weeks on average. They didn't like smoke in their hair. They didn't like the river's way of putting its thumb on the scale. They didn't like the silence of people who had already decided whether the house would live. On a night when the heat finally backed down like a bully and the insects were gentle with the walls, the new wife at Rosebend stood in the dark dining room and touched the backs of chairs as if they were graves. She didn't cry. She had done that. She said a name that was not her husband's and listened for a spoon that did not turn anymore. Then she went upstairs and began to give away clothes. What do you do with a legend that won't stay put? If you're the law, you try to pin it with a nail made from a wanted poster. If you're a banker, you carry it like a stain on your cuff and pretend it'll wash out with the next rain. If you're a preacher, you decide whether to call it wrath or justice, and you choose badly either way. They tried to catch Ruth with a word. Conjure, witch, Jezebel, poisoner. Each title promised an answer if you said it loud enough. None of them fit, none of them kept. A riverboat captain told a story in New Orleans about a woman who cooked for a French family for a month and left the night they praised her too much. She never took the money, he said, and no one believed him, which was fine with the story. A Spanish clerk in Baton Rouge wrote in a tiny hand about a woman who asked for nothing and took only the back door. He filed a report under weather because the category he needed hadn't been invented. In Natchez, the sheriff kept a file in a drawer he didn't lock. It contained 2 pages, his own report from the day the house failed to breathe properly and a note from someone who didn't sign, "She is out of your hands." The note was folded like a prayer and smelled faintly of grease and lavender. He would open the drawer sometimes and pretend the smell had faded. It didn't. There were sightings, the way there are sightings of panthers where panthers ought not be anymore. A woman at a wayside inn who placed a cup in front of a man and made him change his mind about shouting. A cook in a hospital kitchen who showed the nurse where to keep things so fevers broke instead of boys. A figure on the levee at dusk, spoon in pocket, looking down at the river as if taking its temperature. By the time the decade turned, the planters of Adams County had agreed on one thing: don't all eat at the same table anymore. It seemed wise. It felt less like power and more like caution, and that tasted wrong in their mouths. They turned meaner to make up for it, which is the way of men who have been taught that safety is their birthright. It didn't help. Fear isn't a dish you can season away. Years later, a clock's turn, a baby's growth into a woman's hands, a girl in a city with a harbor smelled something on the air that made her taste iron. She worked in a bakery where the ovens sang all day and the steam made the windows weep. The owner was kind when he needed to be and cruel by habit. The girl could flip loaves with a dancer's grace. She could make sugar curl like a question. She could recite, without ever seeing the book, a recipe not for bread but for patience. An older woman came in each Tuesday and bought nothing. She stood near the door, where the light made a ladder on the floor, and watched the girl work. She didn't interrupt. She didn't advise. One day, when the owner had his back turned, the woman slid a small bundle, wrapped in faded cloth like a child's toy, onto the counter and pushed it toward the girl. The girl did not touch it until the bell over the door had told the story of the woman leaving. Inside, a spoon. Old wood, smooth as truth, the handle worn into a pattern that matched exactly the way the girl's hand wanted to hold it, and a line written in a script that favored utility over beauty. Don't drink first. Don't drink last. Keep your eyes on the one who pours. The girl looked up, out into the street that didn't belong to her, and thought she saw the edge of a dress, plain, clean, the kind a woman wears when she intends to get work done. She tucked the spoon into her apron and felt her spine find a memory it had never lived. Years after that, in a settlement upriver where people wrote their own rules on the wall and painted over them when they were wrong, a woman with gray in her hair chopped onions without crying. "They say you knew her," a boy said, trying to look like a man. "They say you were there." The woman didn't look up. "Everybody was there," she said, and the boy frowned because he had wanted a secret and got a riddle. "When somebody stands up in a house made of fear," the woman said, "the whole county is there whether they put on shoes or not." "Is she?" the boy started. "Don't worry where she is," the woman said. "Worry if you know how to taste a room." The decades wore their grooves into the land. Wore past like a fever that leaves some senses sharp and some dulled forever. Papers were signed, and men congratulated each other for what had been wrested away from them, and women counted the silver and found it lighter. Kitchens didn't change how they talk. They still hum when the temperature is right. They still hush when a decision is made that has consequences beyond the dish at hand. At Rosebend, what was left of it, people hung laundry where men had once promised each other empires between bites. Children ran up the steps of a porch that had been rebuilt in a style that masked its scars. Hannah's daughter taught other people's daughters how to make biscuits without measuring cups and without looking down. "Hands remember what the mind is too proud to learn twice," she said, and that sentence might have saved more lives than any law passed in the courthouse with the good paint. A historian from far away came to Natchez with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He wore glasses that made him look careful and carried letters of introduction like talismans. He asked for records and was shown a shelf. He asked for keys and was given a smile. He asked questions and received answers that were stories, answers that were jokes, answers that were silence because some truths don't belong on paper. He found the coroner's report, too clean to be useful, and a list of guests for a supper where no one finished their dessert. He made notes on a pad and the pencil snapped. He left the room to find a sharpener, and a woman with flour on her sleeve slipped in and rearranged the papers so the truth lay next to the lie, and they surprised each other enough to speak. He went down to the river and looked at water that had seen everything and had the audacity not to be impressed. He asked the wrong man if he'd ever heard of Ruth. The man said, "Which one?" And the historian realized the only answer to that question was all of them. He went home and wrote an article that people admired for its footnotes and forgot to taste for its absence of smoke. In a drawer in a house that used to be a boarding house and is now a place where people pay too much for nostalgia, a spoon lay under a folded napkin. Sometimes, when the weather changed, it smelled faintly like lavender and grease. Sometimes, when a woman opened the drawer, she felt the brief pressure of a hand on her wrist, steadying, not stopping. The Natchez trace is quiet when it means to be. Walk it at dusk and you'll hear your own breath first. Then the sound of creatures who hesitate before crossing your path. Wise ones, all. If you walk far enough, and long enough, the trees start telling you about the kitchens they've listened to, the rooms they've shaded, the people they've covered with their silence. Some nights, when the river blows a certain way and the gnats behave, you can stand by the ruins of Rosebend and hear the clink of a spoon in a glass that isn't there. Not haunting. Practice. What did Ruth do exactly? You know better than to ask that like you expect a recipe. What matters is not the how. It's the where and the who, and the fact that the house, built on numbers that didn't count the right things, finally paid a bill it had been handing to other people for generations. They sealed the papers. They shifted the blame. They sold the furniture. They bred myth like they'd bred cotton, on land that was never theirs. But kitchens remember. And kitchens teach. And the lesson does not change. Do not assume the person who feeds you does not decide whether you live. If you are hoping for a map to follow, you're in the wrong story. This isn't an instruction manual. It's a mirror. Look in. See which face you make when power isn't yours to wield. If it's fear, good. Fear might keep you from sitting at a table that requires someone else's hunger to shine. Before we let the fire go low, tell me what you think. Was this supper in Natchez an accident rebranded as fate, or a fate disguised as accident because the truth is too sharp to touch? Do the archives still hide names they consider inconvenient, or have the kitchens already done their own cataloging? Drop your thoughts below. Tell me what town you're listening from and what old house near you never sounds right after dark. And if stories like this, stories that power tried to bury underneath handwriting, matter to you, subscribe to Tales Never Told and ring that bell. Share this with someone who still believes history sits politely at a table and waits to be served. Around here, the past stands up, walks into the kitchen, and turns the spoon. We've got more doors to open, more rooms to make honest. I'll see you next time, where another quiet room is waiting to talk.